Hello, I'm Tim Grimwaite, cognitive behavioural hypnotherapist at Masteryourmind.london, working out of my practice at Bond Street in London, but available worldwide through online sessions. The subject of today's video is social anxiety, a very common presenting issue at my practice, but in ways often that are a bit unexpected and perhaps not exactly as people imagine that social anxiety most often presents itself. More of that in a moment. What I want to achieve in this video is to cover a very brief understanding of the repeating template almost, the repeating mechanisms that make social anxiety possible. It's something that we can observe as a repeating and formulaic thing, although of course individuals will have their own specifics of their social anxiety that are plugged into those repeating mechanisms. So I want to have an understanding of that, but I also want to finish with words of hope, encouragement, and reasons for optimism for those who have struggled with social anxiety, are struggling with it now, even for those who have struggled with it for many years. There is reason to believe that they are able to manage it better and even in some cases to completely overcome it. So I want there to be a message of optimism and hope in the video. So let's have a think about what we're discussing first of all. Social anxiety. It's a situational anxiety, of course, like others are, but why specifically are some social as opposed to others? Well, social anxiety is in effect where there is a key variable of the individual being observed, being witnessed, being heard, being seen, being observed by others. The anxiety does not exhibit itself, is not present in a situation of where they're not observed, when they're in private, when they're alone, when there is no one to see or hear them, but it exhibits itself with no other change but to be witnessed by others. It's the difference between singing in the shower versus singing on the stage at the Albert Hall, perhaps, or dancing at home, or practicing a speech before and then doing it in front of an audience, or being able to sit and enjoy a meal by oneself versus on a first date, for example. The key variable is to be witnessed and observed and in the presence of others who, and then this is the next important point, then have the ability to form a judgment of that individual. In itself, it's not a problem. We're aware that other people can have an opinion and a judgment of us. But in social anxiety, it's the possibility of judgment, which also means the possibility of negative judgment, of condemnation, of negative opinion about the individual. And that is perceived as a threat for the person with social anxiety. Why is that perceived as a threat? For instance, all people can know that other people might not like them, might not rate them very highly, might have a very negative opinion of them and judge them quite harshly, but don't have social anxiety. So what is the key important thing for those that do have social anxiety that's occurring that makes that so, whereas it's not the case for others? Well, that potential and the awareness of the potential for others to negatively judge them in very specific ways comes up against pre-existing, very rigid beliefs about how things must be and must not be. So let's think of a few sort of examples of some of the core beliefs, the rigid demands about other people and life itself and oneself that someone with social anxiety would be likely to have. Again, they would be specific to the individual, but some of the classics are: people must like me. People must think I'm intelligent. They must view me as successful and smart and interesting. I must never humiliate myself in public. I must never make a mistake. I must never make a faux pas. I must always appear confident and bright and interesting. All of these musts and shoulds and this must never happen and so forth. And you can see how the potential, the understanding that is existing of the possibility for negative judgment comes up against those very strong, rigid beliefs. And here is the genesis of the problem when these things come together. This is a commonality in all the people that have social anxiety. There will be very rigid demands of how they are perceived and a strong awareness of the potential of judgment of others when they are appearing before other people. So herein lies the problem. And that very subtly and immediately starts to affect the way that that person exists in that experience, in that situation of being observed. We can talk about that in a moment. We'll park that for a moment. But let's just think about what kind of environments this could affect. Now, the classic sort of caricature of social anxiety might be a certain social awkwardness in sort of leisure activities, social mixing events, things like that. And of course, that is the case. But professionally speaking, across the 10 years that I've been in practice, I've seen all kinds of people with social anxiety, and the most common presentations of it, the number one most common, is in the corporate sector. We don't think about this so much in the corporate sector in our works. As people's careers develop, there is a requirement for social ease in a lot of cases. I'm not talking necessarily about mixing events and after work drinks and stuff like that, although that might be the case. I'm more talking about things like networking, the requirement for networking, to appear confident and competent and at ease when in an interview scenario. As people's careers develop, there are greater demands on them socially to be able to manage individuals one-to-one, in groups, in teams, to manage their superiors and people up the hierarchy chain from them, to give presentations, to manage meetings. All of these require a certain social ease. What I've seen a lot of is people from the corporate sector, highly effective, highly skillful, trained technicians in their particular field, all of the competence and training in the world, but then struggle with the social aspect, the appearing in front of others, the interacting with others, and being able to hold their space in that environment because they feel some of these challenges about how they must be perceived and the strong, rigid demands, etc., and then are not functioning so well within that side of the work, and it inhibits the free progress of their career. The next most common place that I've seen working in practice with people on their social anxiety is around performers, people in the performing arts. Yes, there's the challenge of the actual performance itself in front of a large audience. That's challenging in its own way, but also around that, the audition environment, the rehearsal environment, and so forth can be extremely challenging within that. Just because they're in the performing arts doesn't mean they are immune from social anxieties. Often they go hand in hand as well because they have a very high understanding of the potential for judgment by the nature of the business that they're in. And then, of course, there are the more classic cases of that kind of general social awkwardness that people tend to more familiarly associate with social anxiety. That, of course, shows up, but in many cases, that's aligned with additional presenting issues, and it's just one of the things that we work upon. So we want to think broadly about social anxiety. It can be in all situations, professional or in private life, in social life, where we are in front of others and the potential to be judged. Another facet has opened up in recent years, of course, with the arrival of social media. Now social anxiety can occur to us in the privacy of our own homes whilst we're using social media. When you think about it, there is our sense of metaphorical reward for additional and harsh and extreme judgment of others on social media. It's very much an accepted form within that genre, and also there is massive potential social cost perceived for falling foul of other people's strong, immediate and open judgments within it. So it's really rocket fuel potentially for social anxiety. We tend to think that it's the younger generations who are coming up with that, who are the ones that are going to be affected by that solely. But actually, I've seen people well into adult life that are extremely affected by that milieu as well and can be very challenged by that. So there's potential for it across the board. So let's come back to when the foundations are laid, the awareness that other people could form a judgment of that individual in this scenario, and it's based upon these strong, pre-existing, rigid demands about how they're perceived. I must never make a fool of myself. Everyone must like me. Everyone must find me charming and interesting and competent, etc., etc., specific to that individual, specific to that scenario, and they're pre-existing. And then what do? It's worth bearing in mind that all of that happens in the blink of an eye. I'm outlining and itemizing the various steps of it, but in real life that happens faster than you can interrupt. So we arrive at this point and these very subtle changes happen within people. They become self-monitoring. They go introspective. Of course, they become aware of the physical symptoms of what they feel. It's very common for people to do public speaking, and they feel like they've got a golf ball lodged in their throat. There's a real physiological change to what happens within their throat, or their mouth goes dry, or perhaps their limbs become twitchy. In social scenarios, people can exhibit all kinds of different sort of body languages and stuff like that, and they'll feel their heart rate go up perhaps, or they feel a nausea or butterflies in their tummy. All kinds of different physical symptoms can take place, and it demands the attention of the individual, and they start to become introspective, and here is where the problem starts. Now, a side note on this: when people are suffering and they're really struggling with social anxiety in that particular moment, they fear that they will be perceived as very anxious. People will see I'm blushing and they'll think that I'm, terrified of this, and I'm incapable, and it feeds into the problem. People will see I'm sweating, people will see I'm nervous and twitchy and all of the rest of it. They'll see I'm anxious, and then they will make their negative judgment, goes the logic. But actually, typically, people with social anxiety that are struggling with it, they don't appear necessarily anxious, but they appear aloof, distanced, distracted, and often slightly rude as a result, not really engaged in the interaction that they're taking part in, if it's a social encounter, one-to-one or in a small group. And that's because they are distracted. They've gone into that introspective space, they've noticed the physical sensations, and then they do typically this extraordinary act of cognitive gymnastics. They start to, obviously they have some awareness of what's going on around them, but they start overlapping that and overlaying that with a sense of how they are appearing to others, how they sound, how they look, and trying to second guess the judgment of others. It's almost like a split screen is going on. They become super self-aware, super self-monitoring. And if we kind of use a computing analogy, it's a kind of an extraordinary act of computing power that's going on to not only perceive the world in real time, but also to overlay that with an imagined understanding of how they are coming across. Of course they feel distracted or appear distracted within this, because they are. There is this super overlay of self-monitoring that's going on and trying to perceive how they are perceived, rather than simply easily and in a relaxed and spontaneous way enjoying the conversation or giving the presentation or running the meeting and engaging with the tasks at hand. We're at our best when we're not doing this, when we're uncluttered from this metacognition, from this overlay of overthinking and over-monitoring of ourselves and constant re-examination of how we are performing within that. The individual by this point is really getting in their own way, and of course it affects performance. It's a bit of a clinical word, performance, when sometimes we're talking about, just pure social interactions, a one-to-one chat with someone, a potential friend or a date or something like that, or a job interview, the performance within that, a public speaking presentation, their performance of being able to do that. They're self-monitoring, and of course it gets in the way of the quality of their performance. Now, does that help? Does that suddenly shake them out of their self-monitoring, become more spontaneous, more involved, and more effective in what they're actually doing that? Of course not. It does the opposite. It doubles them down onto their self-monitoring and introspection, and that only increases the problem as well, because they see even more difficulty and discomfort. Then, of course, the performance drops further, and we end up, and we've got a feedback loop, a vicious cycle of the problem that is just accelerating itself and amplifying itself in that situation. Now, in some cases, this will be interrupted by a very specific high demand on that person's attention with it. Something comes up, or they're asked a specific question that they have to focus on, and just the circumstances take them away from that additional, really unhelpful, extra cognitive work that they're doing, and they have to refocus and be very present and mindful on the situation. That's quite a good thing when that happens, because it's kind of leading them back into where they should be. But it can't be relied upon, of course, and it may only be temporary, and they go back to their self-monitoring after that moment has passed and they're back in the problem. The only reliable way that this difficulty, this discomfort, this episode of social anxiety will end is when they leave the scenario, or the other people leave, and they are no longer in that situation of being observed. They are alone again. But that's an escape solution. It's not helpful in the long run, because although they feel better and they feel the liberation of suddenly being alone again, they're no longer observed, and they can have the relief of that, maybe a blissful relief. The problem is still there for next time they have it. And of course, it just marks the beginning of that kind of social post-mortem, the looking back, assessing one's own performance. Oh, I was terrible there. I made a terrible fool of myself. They thought I was very boring, or that, other people saw that I'm incompetent, etc., etc. And a lot of very negative appraisal of one's own performance, appearance, and of course, the threat of judgment of others within that scenario. And of course, that then preloads the anticipatory anxiety that will be in advance of the next social scenario that triggers them in the same way. So you've got across the board all of the ways in which they can feel absolutely dreadful about these kinds of scenes. Now, it's an important part of what we do to understand that mechanism. As I said before, there are specifics for the individual that we could plug in all of the specific components, all of their specific senses of threat. People will see this about me and they will judge me in this way. They will think this about me. That is a problem, because I believe rigidly, etc., etc. People must never see me like X, Y, and Z. They will have their own specific component parts, but the mechanism remains. This is actually my optimism part about it. This is where I can offer hope to those people that have been struggling with this in many cases for many, many years. Typically, this goes back to when people think about it, the first experiences of it were during the teenage years or during school years in certain circumstances, and they can remember some of that experience going back then, but it's continued well into adult life in many cases. I want to offer hope because this is the first stage of being able to interrupt this and to be able to manage these scenarios better. We understand the key component parts for that individual that we're looking to improve, and then we understand how we can switch those components out, how we can replace them with a far more operative, far happier, far more resilient coping strategy specifically tailored for that individual to change out those individual components so that they are able to exist in that space and able to feel calm, confident, and able to operate well. Having worked with hundreds of clients with their social anxiety over the last decade, I'm very confident about the outcomes that people can expect from it. It's a wonderful part of the work that I do, that social anxiety can really be transformed in a very reliable way. Of course, there are those that are super successful and they manage to eradicate it, and I get some wonderful messages and feedback and catch-up notes about what people are achieving in their life subsequent to the work that we do in therapy. But even those that struggle with it, they will have a significant improvement too. And it's about managing all of those scenarios and the symptoms that are attached with them and being able to have long-term improvement from that. I believe that everyone can improve significantly from this, no matter how long they've had the social anxiety for. I hope that's been interesting and helpful for you, and if you think that it would be helpful for others, please share that with them. Let's get the message out there and see if we can help as many people as possible with their social anxiety. It's a very common form of situational anxiety that people have. As ever, if you'd like to discuss this issue or any other that you think I might be able to help you with, my contact details are in the description. You can email me at tim@Masteryourmind.london or visit my website, Masteryourmind.london. I'm happy to start that conversation with you. And as always, like and subscribe so others will be able to find this video as well, and hopefully it will be helpful for them. But I'd like to thank you for watching. More videos coming soon. Thank you.